Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I am your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, going to be talking with State Senator David Hogue, a Republican from R-Minot. He has been a key negotiator, a key mover and shaker on legislation to implement ballot measure 1 from the last election cycle. Of course, it's the quote-unquote ethics measure that was passed by voters and now needs implementing legislation from the legislature, right? Because we amended the state constitution, but now we need actual laws and statute that enforce what we put into the state constitution. You'll hear him talk about that. There's some complaints that, they're leaving loopholes in the law. I think what Senator Hogue and I reach, the conclusion that we reach is essentially that, yes, obviously we have to follow whether we like it or not. And I certainly didn't like Measure 1. It is law. It is in the state constitution now, and the legislature has to follow it. On the flip side of the coin, however, there are other constitutional provisions we have to consider that protect things like free speech, that protect things like political activity. So, it's a little bit of a balancing act. But I want for a moment to talk about another policy debate that the legislature has been having, and in fact has passed and put on the ballot for the next cycle, which is reform to the initiated measure process itself. And Senator Hogue, by the way, introduced legislation, an amendment to the state constitution. And essentially what it would do is it would allow, if voters approve it, right? Because all amendments to our constitution have to be approved by the voters one way or the other. If the voters approve it, what it would do is it would say that any constitutional amendment passed by voters has to be approved by the legislature. If the legislature says yes to it as well, then it goes on the ballot. If the legislature says no, well, then it goes back to the people and the voters get another crack at it. It makes the process of amending our state constitution harder. It makes the process longer. And I think, frankly, both of those are good things. The state constitution is a hugely important document, and it ought not be changed on a whim. Now, what's interesting about the debate around that is a lot of people say, well, that's just, it's the legislature subverting the democratic process. It's the legislature taking power away from the people. And all of that made me think of a quote from one of my favorite authors, Robert Heinlein. He's a science fiction author. You may be familiar with him. If you've ever heard the phrase, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, well, that was Robert Heinlein from his book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. If you've ever heard somebody say that they grok something, well, that's from his book, Stranger in a Strange Land. Hugely influential author. One of his characters was a man by the name of Lazarus Long. He was somebody through certain genetic traits and then scientific enhancements was able to live a very long life. He's a character in books like Methuselah's Children, worth your time checking out, books from the golden age of science fiction. Anyway, he had a quote, and this is his character Lazarus Long speaking, but this is a quote from Robert Heinlein. He writes, I quote, "There are hidden contradictions in the minds of people who love nature, while deploring the artificialities with which man has spoiled nature. The obvious contradiction lies in their choice of words, which imply that a man and his artifacts are not part of nature, but beavers and their dams are." Now, essentially what that means is that if a beaver builds a dam for a beaver's purposes, then somehow that's natural and that's part of nature. But if a man builds a dam for man's needs, or I should say if humanity, right, because man's a little archaic, I don't want to use that term. Let's say humanity builds a dam for humanity's purposes, that's somehow unnatural because somehow humanity is separate from nature. Somehow we are separate from the environment that we live in. Now, what Heinlein argues is that that's baloney. We are, of course, of the world that we are also in. We are of the world that we are changing, just as beavers are of the world that they are changing. We are part of nature too. And so bringing that back to the debate over initiated measures, people who argue that the legislature is somehow, sinning against the gospel of direct democracy, I would point out that the legislature is the will of the people too. And this is something I think a lot of people overlook. We get so caught up in this idea that, the electorate is infallible. We have a lot of different avenues through which we make public policy. And generally, we agree that the legislative branch is part of it, and the executive branch is part of it, and the voters are part of it. But we also have a system of checks and balances on all these different types of policy making. We don't ever concentrate power in any one area. And usually we have a process through which public policy must go through so that it's vetted. You know, things like committee hearings, things like public hearings. I mean, it's, an amendment process. I mean, usually that's how it works in the legislature, right? A bill gets introduced, it goes to committee, it goes to a floor vote in one house, and then if it passes there, it goes over to the next house, and it gets a committee hearing, and it gets amendments, and then it gets a floor vote, and then if the two chambers pass substantially different bills, then they have to have a conference committee and hammer out those bills until each chamber concurs with a final bill, and then it goes to the executive branch, and the executive branch makes an informed choice about whether they're gonna, the governor's gonna sign it into law, or if the governor's gonna veto it, and then if the governor vetoes it, it can go back to the legislature, and the legislature can override that veto, and it's a really complicated process with all sorts of opportunities for the public to weigh in, for the law to be amended. It's a good process. Not a perfect one, but a good one. And it's rigorous. And it bears no resemblance at all to the initiated measure process. Now, I should add here that the amendment that's going to be on the ballot next year would only affect constitutional amendments. So if you're thinking about starting a ballot measure campaign to amend this just state law, just state statute, everything about that would remain the same. But if we're going to amend the Constitution, there's going to be a more rigorous process if this amendment is passed, and it should pass. And it's not some sort of assault against the will of the people, because again, the legislature is the will of the people as well, right? I mean, the legislature is elected of the people. I don't understand people who will, thump their chests and go on and on about the wisdom of the people and how the will of the people and how, the initiated measures are the most purest expression of the will of the people. And then, act like our legislators are a bunch of corrupt idiots who are out of touch and have no idea what the people want. I mean, essentially what you're arguing is that voters are somehow super tuned in and intelligent and not at all apathetic or prone to whimsy when it comes to evaluating complicated pieces of policy, complicated initiated measures that could amend our state constitution. The voters are fine there, but somehow they're a bunch of distracted, apathetic idiots when it comes to electing our legislators. You realize that these issues are all on the same ballot, right? When you go and vote, you're voting for not just for ballot measures, you're voting for lawmakers too. It's the same electorate. It's the same people. That's the mistake we make. In the same way that we make the mistake of assuming that somehow humanity is not part of nature, we make the mistake of assuming that the legislature is somehow not a reflection of the will of the people. We are choosing the people who are in the legislature. That's our choice. And oh, by the way, most of the people from the legislature, when they decide to run for re-election, most of them get re-elected. So this idea that the legislature is doing some horrible job, I mean, okay, if that's true, then why don't the voters do something about it? Why don't they elect different people? Why don't different people run for office? And I think the answer for that is the legislature's not actually doing that bad of a job. I think it's just fashionable in some circles for, reasons that maybe have to do with partisanship or reasons just having to do with people not really understanding the process, which by the way is interesting. I like hearing from people weigh in on the legislature and what a bunch of idiots the legislature is. The next time you hear somebody doing that, ask them who their lawmakers are. You think they know? I'm telling you, more times than not, they probably don't. Which maybe tells you everything you need to know about how tuned in those people really are. I think it's a very childish construction, this idea that, the initiated measure process is the purest reflection of the will of the people. I mean, it's really not. The people make mistakes. It's really kind of playing Russian roulette. I mean, you have groups come in and they get a bunch of money and they pay a bunch of signature collectors and they put an issue on a ballot and then they bombard us with TV ads and radio ads and social media messaging and everything else, hoping that their issue will win out. And there's few checks and balances in that process. There's absolutely nothing in the way of holding committee hearings or public hearings or allowing the public to weigh in on how, these proposals are written. I mean, they just show up on our ballots, right? You and I don't get a chance to attend a hearing. There's no amendment process. Other ideas can't be incorporated. They're just put on the ballot for a straight up or down vote. And the whole thing really kind of depends. I mean, it's almost like we're deciding what the law is going to be based on which TV ad the majority of citizens saw about a given ballot measure. I mean, that's really where we're at. And I realize that's maybe kind of a cynical way of looking at it, but I'll tell you, the American public is asked to do a lot. When we go to the ballot box, I mean, we're asked to make decisions about presidents and senators and congressmen and statewide executive office holders, governors and the insurance commissioner and the tax commissioner and all those people, and then legislators, and then local leaders like mayors and city council and county commissioners, and then judges, and on down the list. And then we're asked to also know about all the nuances of very complicated. I mean, Marsy's Law remember that from a couple cycles ago? Marsy's Law, which was also put in our state constitution, was a hugely complicated piece of public policy. And the only vetting it got was during a campaign cycle. Measure 1, last cycle, the ethics measure, was a hugely complicated piece of policy. How many people really do you think paid attention to it? An election that, in a lot of ways, was overshadowed by that U.S. Senate race between Kevin Cramer and Heidi Heitkamp. I mean, how many people do you think really paid attention? Not as many as I think either you or I would like. So I've made it clear. I do not like the initiated measure process. I do not like direct democracy in general. I think it's a poor way to make public policy. But I also realize that that's a minority point of view. So if we're going to have it, and we are going to insist on passing complicated pieces of policy like Measure 1 or Marsy's Law or what have you at the ballot box, then the process needs to be more rigorous, particularly when it comes to amending the state constitution. It ought to be more than just an up or down vote. It ought to be more than just a 50+1 majority. Subjecting it to legislative scrutiny as well is just fine. There's nothing wrong with it. That's not wresting. That's not some sin against democracy. That's not overriding the will of the people. That's providing for a more rigorous, more thorough process for vetting public policy before it becomes a part of the most important legal document in our state, second only to the U.S. Constitution. My interview with Senator David Hogue up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Joining me now is Senator David Hogue. He's a Republican from Minot. He's also been one of the leaders in working out, I guess what you would call the implementation legislation from Measure 1. Measure 1, of course, was they called the ethics ballot measure. I have my problems with it. It looks like misguided and certainly, echoing groups like the ACLU. I think it's got implications for speech. I think it's got implications for political participation. I know a lot of the supporters think that they're sticking it to the special interests, but I'll tell you, the deep pocket special interests that you think you're going after, they have lawyers they can hire to find loopholes and get around this stuff. The people you're hurting are the grassroots people who are now going to feel even more intimidated than they already are when it comes to participating in politics. All of that aside, though, one side won the debate, and Measure 1 is something the legislature has to implement. And Senator Hogue, you guys are at a point where you have some legislation. And I was just reading today your colleague, Senator Tim Mathern, Democrat from Fargo, who was also on the sponsoring committee for Measure 1, saying there's too many loopholes in this bill. But first of all, let's start here. Tell us about the implementing legislation. Describe it for us.
Okay, well, it does a number of things. As you know, the Measure 1 required the legislature to do several things. One is to establish penalties for violations of Measure 1. And the other thing is to stand up the Ethics Commission and fund the Ethics Commission so it can operate as a small agency within state government. And so we've provided for both of those. We've also, the current law, we regulate lobbyists, and lobbyists are people who are defined, who come before the legislature or go to the governor to advocate for or against a legislative bill. The measure required, and we have expanded our oversight to people who, quote, try to influence state government action, which we've now defined as those people who are advocating for or against the adoption of administrative rules by administrative agencies. So we're going to bring those folks as well as the people who appear before the legislature. So that's kind of a second piece to what we've done. We've also tightened up the reporting requirements for, if you're giving to an organization, but you're really wanting to give to a political candidate or to a initiated measure, those disclosures have to be revealed if you're contributing more than $200 and your intent is to fund a candidate or an initiated measure or anything that's on the statewide ballot.
Now, Senator Mathern is saying that you could drive, and I'm quoting now, this is from a report in the Grand Forks Herald written by my colleague John Hageman. He says, I quote, "You can drive a truck through this." Mathern says that the bill includes what he described as financial transparency loopholes, constrains the definition of lobbyist, and limits what it means to influence state government action. The group that backed Measure 1, North Dakota's Republic Integrity, raised similar concerns in an email issued Tuesday evening. Now, he goes on to say, he says, though Mathern said somebody could challenge the bill in court on the grounds it doesn't meet constitutional requirements, he said he hasn't been told directly that's on the horizon. So his implication, Senator Hogue, is that if your legislation doesn't go far enough in implementing the constitutional measure, the state could get sued for people saying, well, we're not following the state constitution. But I think there's an issue there because some of this stuff, if you define lobbyists too broadly, if you require too many reporting requirements, well, then I think you run into a problem at the other end of the spectrum, which are issues like where groups like the ACLU was talking about, where this is political activity. Spending money on politics is protected free speech per the U.S. Supreme Court. Political activity obviously is protected speech, protected activity. If you go too far in regulating that activity, you're going to face a constitutional challenge on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're hearing from Senator Mathern, I think fairly describe it as posturing. And in this process, none of us ever get exactly what we want in a bill. It's always a pushback from other people with other political beliefs, people with other beliefs about what is best policy. And you're exactly right. You could literally require every conversation between somebody who's trying to persuade the governor or another state official to do a certain thing or make a specific appointment or to make a decision on an administrative matter, and you could require all of these people to disclose all of these conversations. And it's just not a workable solution. Yeah. We think we've covered the critical steps to trying to influence government action, which are, of course, all administrative rules, all legislative bills, all actions of the governor with respect to legislative bills. So that's a pretty good swath of, quote, state government action. And the question that maybe Senator Mathern should ask or be asked is, well, he proposed a bill in the Senate, and it didn't address these loopholes he's talking about now. So what has happened? Has he changed his view, or has he have other reasons to speak against the bill? And I submit it's not because the bill doesn't comprehensively address what Measure 1 requires it to do. I would suggest that it just doesn't go, since it's been a learning process for all of us, but I think he's learned more and he wants to keep pushing the bill farther and farther to what I would describe as overbearing, unnecessary regulation.
There's one thing that I was concerned about, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit in terms of your implementing legislation. People like me in the media, our work influences government, right? I mean, whether I'm obviously a commentator, right. I'm an opinion guy. So, I mean, sometimes I'll write a post or I'll do a podcast or I'll go on the radio and say, this is how I think it ought to be, right? And then people disagree with me and we have a debate, and that's our society, right? That's what we do. That's all great. Right. You could argue, because we spend, my employer spends, I'll tell you, more than $200 a year employing me, and paying for equipment and hosting fees and all that other stuff. I mean, we're influencing the government. Now, and we also, even our straight reporters, right? I mean, if John Hageman is not an opinion reporter, John Hageman is a straight reporter, but sometimes he uncovers stories that influence policy outcomes. Now, he doesn't necessarily have an agenda. He's not conservative, liberal, or anything like that, but his work, when you do journalism right, it impacts the world around us. So,
right.
I think there's been a lot of people in the media worried, are we going to have to start reporting what we spend? I mean, what are the requirements there? I'm assuming the media is exempt from this. I wasn't so sure. The original Measure 1, there were no exemptions for us in the media.
Yeah, well, I've talked to a number of people because here's the problem with these constitutional amendments. I appreciate you've written a lot about this in the past, but you can't get inside their intent because you can't figure out where this was drafted. Was it drafted, inside the confines of a law firm, in a out-of-state firm? And so what did they intend by these measures? At first we had a thought, well, mate, does this apply to the judiciary? Well, no, it doesn't, because there's nothing in there that includes it. But yet it talks about public officials. Well, all of our state district court judges, all of our Supreme Court justices, they're public officials. So
elected, many of them.
Argument,
yeah, I mean, our state Supreme Court's elected. Our district court judges are elected.
Right. So you can make that argument. And so you're trying to get inside their thought process, but there's nothing that you can do because the measure was not vetted. It didn't have a public hearing process. It didn't have proponents who proposed amendments to it based on concerns of stakeholders. So we again are forced to sort of speculate about what was intended by this measure. And the media is another potentially affected group of stakeholders. Well, clearly they can influence state government action. And the question is, all right, well, obviously we don't want to cover them because we have a First Amendment in our U.S. Constitution, and we also have, a free speech amendment in the North Dakota Constitution that says the media is able to operate unfettered by rules about, lobbying or being told what they can cover and what they can't. So it's just another good example of why it's, generally a bad idea to put these measures in the Constitution where we're not able to clarify them. Another good example is this prohibition in Measure 1 that talks about that the lobbyist is unable to deliver a political contribution. Well, in North Dakota, we don't know what the point of that is. I mean, in many of the organizations that want to support candidates and have the right to do so, it's a simple matter of handing over a check at an event or a fundraiser, and so now they can't do that, and we don't understand what evil is to be avoided by having the lobbyist physically deliver a contribution that lobbyist organization wants to make to
a contribution that would still fall under transparency and reporting laws that predated Measure 1. I mean, a lobbyist,
right,
if a lobbyist gives a candidate a donation, that candidate has to report it in the same manner any other donation would be reported. I mean, listen, I don't want to pretend like I thought our laws were perfect before Measure 1. On the transparency side specifically, I'm very much a disclose, don't restrict person. I think people should generally be able to do what they want, but it should all be disclosed as far as political giving and all that. So I feel like we could have done more frequent reporting. I think we ought to get rid of the $200 threshold. We live in a digital era. I think a lot of those things were created because maybe back in the 70s when all the bookkeeping was done on paper, it was hard to make, frequent disclosures. It's as easy as uploading a spreadsheet now. So let's get serious about some better reporting. We can do it now, and it's not that much of a so if people want to have that debate, I'm with you. What I worry about though is that we've gotten so far, our system of government is designed where public officials are supposed to be influenced. Right? I mean, it's a government by the people. So we sort of constituted this idea, well, these evil lobbyists and these evil special interests, but evil special interests like teachers groups, right? I mean, the North Dakota United represents
Right.
North Dakota's teachers and North Dakota's public workers. They obviously have a say. I agree with them sometimes, disagree with them other times, but they have a say and they have an agenda and they have every right to pursue that. Farmers groups, right? Energy industry groups, entrepreneur groups, business groups. I mean, there's all sorts of different groups out there, and they all, I think we get so down in the weeds saying, oh, they're influencing. You're supposed to be influenced. I know that you're influenced all the time, Senator Hogue. You get emails from constituents, you get emails from groups, and it affects your decision making in the legislature, and it should. I don't understand what we're finding. I mean, we've, and this was my problem with Measure 1. They were so zealous about it that they've lumped in a large dollop of what I consider to be perfectly legitimate, activity in a democratic society.
Yeah, well, the ethics bill itself is a perfect example of what you're talking about, because we had, I think we had 4 hearings, and every time we had a hearing, we could have had the formalistic, no, time for testimony is done, we're not going to take any further testimony or suggestions. But the hearings were well attended, and we took suggestions from state agency heads. We took suggestions from private individuals. We took suggestions that Senator Mathern received through some of the proponents. And in a series of those 4 hearings, we must have had close to 20 amendments that we considered and either voted up or down to accept or reject based on that public input. And all of those people, of course, were lobbying us, were trying to persuade us that what they were proposing was good policy. But I mean, that is the process. You have legislators drafting policy, and all the while they're listening to people who, again, have an opinion about that particular bill. And yeah, you're right. There's nothing wrong with that. That is our process, and it's the process we should have.
Tell me, just real quickly, where are we at with this legislation? It's supposed to be voted on today, and when I say today, we're recording this on Wednesday. This podcast will be up on Thursday, so we're a little ahead of the game here. But where is this legislation at now? Okay,
on Monday, House Bill 1521 will be voted on by the Senate. We put on some significant amendments to change it from what it came over to the Senate with. And it'll be immediately, if it passes, it'll be immediately messaged over to the House for them to either concur or non-concur. And we'll go into conference committee, if there's going to be a conference committee, no later than this Wednesday.
Do you expect significant changes? I mean, obviously, this has been a lengthy process. I know both chambers have been involved in because it's a little bit unique. You guys are implementing a piece of policy that's already been approved by the voters. So it's not your typical sort of bill. I mean, is it your feeling that what the Senate has come up with these amendments, that this is going to fly in the House, that this is probably going to be it or close to it?
It'll be close to it. I think I've spoken to a couple of the leaders in the House, and they're favorably inclined on it. That doesn't mean they will concur and accept the whole thing, but they recognize that it was done in the spirit of compromise between, the Senate majority and the Senate minority, and so they understand that we've made our good faith effort to try to implement what's in Article 14.
And just last question. This was obviously implemented through the initiated measure process. You have also been very involved in reform efforts for the initiated measure process. In fact, a constitutional amendment that you introduced has been passed by the legislature, which would, it's not a new thing. We're actually taking the initiated measure process for constitutional amendments, not statutory changes, but constitutional amendments back to the way it was when the initiated measure process was first created around the turn of the last century. It essentially would give the legislature a chance to veto something that's a constitutional amendment that's approved by voters. So essentially, voters put it on the ballot. If they approve it, then the legislature gets to say yay or nay. If the legislature says yay, then it's law. If they say nay, well, then it goes back for another vote.
Right.
I think that gets, because a criticism you had of Measure 1 is it didn't go through hearings. We didn't have a debate. We didn't hash this out. And so it's hard when implementing it to parse. Well, what did we mean by this? What was the intent here? I think what your intent with this amendment that you've put on the ballot is, let's have a more rigorous process. let's have more checks and balances. Is that a fair description?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think our founders got it right. And, back then people weren't out paying people to gather signatures to put their measure on the ballot. And if you think about it, the constitutional amendment process that we have now is exactly what the out-of-state interests would prefer. They don't want their measure subject to any public scrutiny by people in North Dakota who will be subject to that constitutional amendment. They would simply like to have it approved as to form by the Secretary of State for circulation, and then they trot out some pithy slogan about, hey, this will stop corruption in government. Vote for this. And of course, we both know that that is not a way to amend the Constitution by this almost closed off process where we don't have any public input until the voters actually go to the polls in November and vote it up or down.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch. There's a lot of people. We could do a whole nother segment, but you only gave me. So I know you're a busy man down there. You only have so much time. We could do a whole nother segment on the initiated measure process and the proposed reform. And I have a feeling we will be, because that is going to be an issue for debate in the next election. Senator Hogue, thanks for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity.
That's it for today's episode. Thanks as always for listening. New episodes come out Monday through Friday, right away in the morning. If you have any feedback on the show, please send it to rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can certainly give me feedback as well via social media. I'm on Facebook as Rob Port. I'm on Twitter @Rob Port. Say Anything Blog has a Facebook and Twitter account as well. That's the account to follow if you just want the political stuff, just the blog posts, just the podcast, just the columns. My personal profiles have, personal stuff as well. Also, if you're listening to this on a platform like iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, where you're allowed to leave a rating or review, if you would do that for me, I would sure appreciate it. The more ratings and reviews we get, the better it is. That it makes it easier for people to find the podcast. It makes it more likely that these services will promote this podcast to other listeners who might be interested. So that helps out a lot. And of course, if you have any trouble at all subscribing to this podcast at any service, I would like to hear about it. First of all, to help you subscribe, but also, I don't want other people to be having problems as well. Obviously, I want as many people to be able to find this podcast as possible. So if you just send me a heads up, rob@sayanythingblog.com. I'd be happy to help you and grateful that you let me know about the issue. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.